I want to open today's message with another installment of Black History Highlight. And unlike the past three where I've highlighted individuals to lift up for our hearing, today I want to lift up a process, a way of being that informs who we are today. One of the earliest documented arrivals of slavery in America, well, what wasn't even America at that point, but to these lands, was 1619. It was called and quoted 20 Odd and Negro. That this group brought over upon a boat called the White Horse or the White Lion was brought to what was still being developed as the colony of Virginia. These 20 are some of the first documented references that we have of Africans being placed here as slaves. This is not the first time that slaves had touched the Americas, nor is it the first time that they had touched some of the settlements in what we now call America. But this is one of the first places that we have it documented. 20 Odd and Negro. And as we think about Black history, one of the things I often sense is some of this historical past is really challenging for us to talk about. We either like to disbelieve it or not talk about it at all, or many of us, Africans and non-African Americans as well, like to move past it because we feel that this unrightly ties us to negativity as opposed to positivity. When I think about this, I think about how often I myself teach my children about slavery and its meaning, how that moves them forward, some of these things being such a bad and negative thing. But one of the challenges that I have is when we think about history, I think history, if told incorrectly, can have negative ramifications. And one of the challenges, even with the history that we know, is far too often it has been reduced. It's reductionary. Even sometimes the tales of slavery. When we think of slavery, we automatically go to chattel slavery as we have come to know it, both in the deep South and maybe even some of the northern states. But we must remember that this is not even how slavery starts here. Because if we don't remember that, we might start believing something to be true that never was. That the first slaves that arrived to what is now the Americas did not come as lifelong slaves. They were initially to work for 7 years, and that got extended to about 10, sometimes as long as 15. But after this service, they were freed. In the earliest colonies, that there were Africans that were here that lived as freed men and women. And the colonies themselves, as they were developing, did not have an initial understanding of black as being bad. In fact, slavery wasn't even initially legalized in many of the colonies. It is not to some 30, 40 years later, 40 years after 1619, that we start seeing the vestiges of possibilities of slavery becoming even legalized, meaning that our country didn't start off all moving one direction. And as it didn't start off all moving one direction, there hasn't always been people that have agreed with the direction that our country went and the colonies went. In fact, lifelong slavery, the first place that we have even the idea, the possibility of a lifelong slave is 1640. A man named John Puck. And he was put into lifelong slavery not just because of his birth, but because he was a runaway and his slave masters were angry at him. But even in the colonies, blacks were initially given the ability to own slaves. It was written into law. That law was later changed, as was the law for them to bear arms, as was the law for so many other things, meaning that there was a shift in course. And sometimes the way we start is not the way we finish. And sometimes where we finish can be better or worse than where we began. The vestiges of our country is the vestiges of people trying to make sense of the world and things not always making sense. Black has not always been bad, even on this land. But if we don't tell the story that way, we begin to forget our inception, and we believe that our country has always been, or everybody that's a part of our country has always been, when it hasn't been true. But what this does lift up is, just because everybody doesn't always agree, a silent majority is not as powerful as a loud minority if we're not willing to fight for truth. That things, and we can see this all throughout our history, there have always been people who have challenged slavery, that haven't always been of African descent. There have been whites that were saying, we don't believe that this is right, that have fought in this fight. Yet, if we don't fight hard, negative things can happen. So, history, if we can learn from it, can become a gift. If we can see its truthfulness and we can recognize that Africans have not always been slaves, that African American history or black history is not just the history of slavery, it's so much more. But it calls us as a country, number one, to be reminded of its truth and to learn so that we don't make the same mistakes again. So that we don't see things happening and believe that our silence is okay when we see negativity rising up. That we don't keep saying, surely this will never happen and surely it will never get that bad again. So we can be quiet when the truth is the issue of our country has been people who have been quiet for too long. And then when we start to speak, sometimes it is too late. And in our history focus, as we look back, I think that gives us a future focus to say, is it now time for maybe us to speak up again? And not just to speak up to be angry and to fight, not just for African Americans, but maybe for all of us. For us to tell the history of our country in such a way that it is empowering to all people so that we can never divulge into what we used to be, but we can be the light that we want to say that we are. And that if we want to be the greatest country and we want to be great, maybe not again, but maybe for the first time, it is not by us going back and being something negative. It is by us moving forward to live into the truths that we can. And there's possibility for it if we learn from the history. Because history can be a gift.